She found the letter on a Tuesday in March, 2 months after she buried him. Clara Wesson had been meaning to give Henry's coat away since January. It had been hanging on the peg by the door where he always left it. A heavy brown wool coat with a corduroy collar and brass buttons that had gone green with age, and every morning when she walked past it, she caught the smell of him, wood smoke and horse sweat and the lye soap he used on his hands after working cattle, and every morning the smell stopped her for a moment, the way a hand on the shoulder stops a person mid-stride. 2 months was long enough. That was what Martha Greer had said when she came by with bread and preserves and the particular kind of silence that women on the frontier offer each other when words would only make things worse. 2 months was long enough to keep a dead man's coat on a peg, give it to the church, give it to a drifter, give it to anyone who needs wool more than you need a ghost by the door. Clara took the coat down on a Tuesday morning when the light was gray and the snow was melting off the barn roof in long drips that sounded like a clock running down. She held it in her arms the way she had held Henry on the night before he died, close and full and aware that the warmth was temporary. She pressed her face into the collar one last time and breathed in, and then she folded it and carried it to the kitchen table to check the pockets before she gave it away. The pockets held what you would expect: a folding knife with a bone handle, a stub of pencil worn down to 2 inches, 3 copper pennies and a button from a shirt she had mended 2 winters ago, a piece of string tied in a knot that meant something to Henry and nothing to anyone else. She set each item on the table like artifacts from a life that had been ordinary and good, and was now over. Then her hand found the lining. The inside pocket had a tear in it, or what she thought was a tear until she looked closer and saw the stitching. Someone had opened the lining of the coat along the inside seam, slipped something flat between the wool and the canvas backing, and sewn it shut again with small, careful stitches that were not Henry's. Henry could mend a fence and shoe a horse, but he could not sew a straight line to save his life. Someone else had sewn this, someone who knew how to handle a needle the way a seamstress does, with precision and habit, and the kind of care that comes from doing the same motion 10,000 times. Clara got her scissors and cut the stitches. The letter was folded twice and pressed flat from being worn against Henry's body for what must have been months or years. The paper was soft and thin, almost translucent, the kind of paper you buy at a general store when you cannot afford stationery. She unfolded it and read the name on the front: Nora Albright. Elk Crossing, Montana Territory. Clara had never heard the name. She had never heard of Elk Crossing. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands and the coat on the table, and the sound of snowmelt dripping off the barn roof, and she read it. The letter was in Henry's handwriting. She knew his hand the way she knew his voice, the way the letters leaned right, and the way he crossed his T's with a long, flat stroke, and the way he wrote the letter S, like a man who had learned penmanship from a school teacher who cared about such things. It was dated October of the previous year, 3 months before he died, and it was never sent. He wrote about a child, a girl named Lily. He wrote that he had been sending money when he could, and that he was sorry it wasn't more. He wrote that he had seen them last in the spring when he rode east to sell cattle, and had stopped in Elk Crossing, and had held Lily on his knee, and that she had his eyes and his chin, and that every time he left, it got harder to leave. He wrote that he wanted to tell Clara, but that telling Clara would destroy 2 families instead of saving one, and he had decided a long time ago that carrying the weight alone was better than dropping it on the people he loved. He wrote that he loved Nora. He wrote it plainly, without apology. the way a man states a fact about the weather or the condition of the road. He wrote that he also loved Clara, and that the two things were both true, and that he had never figured out how a man could hold two truths that contradicted each other and still get up every morning and feed the cattle and fix the fence and sit across the table from his wife and not say anything. He signed it Henry, with no last name, as if even on paper he was trying to keep the two lives from touching. Clara read the letter 3 times. She read it once fast, the way you read bad news, taking in the shape of it before the details. She read it again, slowly, word by word, hearing Henry's voice behind each line, because she could not help it, because 12 years of marriage trains your ear to hear a man even when he is dead, and the words are on paper and the voice is only memory. She read it a 3rd time, looking for the lie, looking for the sentence that would tell her this was not real, that Henry had written it for someone else, or as a story, or as some kind of exercise in penmanship, and she did not find it because there was no lie. The letter was the truest thing Henry had ever written, and that was the part that broke her. She did not cry. She sat at the table with the letter flat in front of her, and the coat beside it, and the items from his pockets lined up like evidence, and she felt something drain out of her that she would later understand was certainty. For 12 years she had been certain of Henry Wesson, certain of his honesty, certain of his loyalty, certain that the life they had built on the Montana plains was solid and real and made of the same material all the way through. Now she was holding a letter that said otherwise, and the certainty was gone, and without it, the house felt different, the way a house feels when you realize the foundation has been cracked all along, and you just never looked. She didn't tell anyone for a week. She went about her work, feeding the 2 remaining horses, breaking ice on the water trough, hauling wood for the stove, mending the fence where the elk had pushed through in February. She did everything she had done since Henry died, except now she did it with the letter in her apron pocket, folded and refolded until the creases were wearing through, because she could not bring herself to leave it in the house, and she could not bring herself to throw it away. At night she lay in the bed they had shared for 12 years, and stared at the ceiling and reconstructed their marriage the way a person reconstructs a house after a storm, examining each wall and beam and joint to see which ones were real and which ones had been painted to look solid. She thought about the spring trips. Henry always went east to sell cattle, 2 or 3 days, sometimes 4, and he always came back quieter than when he left. She had thought it was the travel, the loneliness of long rides. Now she understood the quietness was the weight of a man climbing back into one life after leaving another, the silence of a door closing behind him that she had never known was open. She thought about the money. They had never been rich, but they had never been short. And yet there were years when the cattle sold well and the money still felt thin, and Henry had blamed it on equipment costs and feed prices and the dozen small expenses that eat a ranch alive from the edges. Now she knew where those margins went. They went east. They went to a cabin by a creek, where a seamstress was raising a child on thread and whatever a cattle rancher could spare, without his wife noticing. Martha Greer came by on the following Monday with eggs and the news that the river was rising early this year. She sat at Clara's table and drank coffee and talked about the weather and the price of beef and the new family that had moved into the Patterson place. And Clara listened and said nothing about the letter until Martha stood up to leave. And Clara said, "Did you know Henry had a child?" Martha sat back down. Clara showed her the letter. Martha read it once, slowly, her lips moving the way they did when she was thinking. And then she set it on the table and looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who has lived 50 years and has learned that surprise is a luxury she can no longer afford. "I didn't know," Martha said, "but I'm not shocked. Henry rode east twice a year to sell cattle. Most men sell cattle in Billings. Henry always went to Elk Crossing, which is 40 miles past anywhere a man with sense would go to sell beef." "You noticed that and didn't say anything?" "What was I going to say? Your husband rides too far to sell cattle?" A woman doesn't say that to another woman's marriage. You trust it or you don't. And I trusted Henry because you trusted Henry. And that was enough. Clara looked at the letter on the table. The paper was so thin now from folding and refolding that she could see the grain of the wood through it. "There's a child," she said. "A girl, 7 years old." "Yes. Henry's been dead 2 months. If he was sending money, the money stopped 2 months ago." Martha looked at her. "Clara, I'm going to Elk Crossing." She left the next morning before dawn. She saddled the gray mare, the steadier of the 2 horses, and packed food for 3 days in a bedroll and the letter in her coat pocket, not Henry's coat but her own, a canvas duster she had worn through 3 Montana winters. The ride to Elk Crossing was 40 miles east, through open rangeland that rolled like a frozen sea, brown grass and patches of snow, and the Yellowstone River winding through the valley below. And she rode it in a day and a half, sleeping 4 hours in a dry creek bed, wrapped in her blanket with the mare tied to a cottonwood. She arrived in Elk Crossing on a Wednesday afternoon. It was barely a town. A freight depot and a general store, and a blacksmith and a scattering of cabins along a creek that fed into the Yellowstone. She asked at the store for Nora Albright, and the man behind the counter pointed east without asking why, the way people in small towns point when they have learned not to ask questions about other people's business. The cabin was a 1/4 mile from town, set back from the creek in a stand of cottonwoods that were bare and gray in the March light. It was small, 1 room and a lean-to, with a vegetable garden that was still frozen, and a clothesline with a child's dress hanging stiff in the cold air. Smoke came from the chimney. A pair of chickens scratched in the yard. Clara tied the mare to the fence and stood in the yard for a full minute before she knocked. She didn't know what she was going to say. She had rehearsed speeches for 40 miles, angry speeches and sad speeches and cold speeches and speeches that started with accusations and speeches that started with questions, and none of them had survived the ride because the ride had given her too much time to think. And thinking had burned away everything except the one fact she could not get past. There was a child, Henry's child, and the child's mother was on the other side of this door. Nora Albright opened the door the way a woman opens a door when she is not expecting anyone and is mildly alarmed by the knock. She was younger than Clara had imagined. Dark hair loosely tied back, a narrow face with high cheekbones, wearing a patched wool dress and holding a pincushion, which meant she had been working. Behind her, sitting on the floor by the stove with a slate and a piece of chalk, was a girl of 7 with sandy hair and a round face and Henry's eyes. Henry's exact eyes, the same shade of gray-blue that Clara had looked into for 12 years across the supper table, and the sight of them in a child's face hit her like a fist in the chest. "You're Clara," Nora said. Not a question. "How do you know that?" "Because you look like a woman who found a letter she wasn't supposed to find. And because you rode 40 miles in March to see for yourself instead of burning it. Henry said you would do that. He said if you ever found out, you wouldn't burn it and you wouldn't pretend. He said you'd come." Clara looked past her at the girl on the floor. The girl looked up from her slate with Henry's eyes and smiled the way children smile at strangers, open and trusting and unaware of the weight in the room. "Her name is Lily," Nora said. "I know. He wrote about her. Do you want to come in?" Clara stood in the doorway of a stranger's cabin and looked at a child who shared her dead husband's face and felt something she did not expect. Not anger, not betrayal. Those had burned out on the ride. What she felt was grief, but not her own. She was grieving for Henry, who had loved 2 women and a child, and had carried the weight of it alone for 7 years, because he thought that was the brave thing to do. And she was grieving for Nora, who had raised a daughter in a 1-room cabin on a seamstress's wages, knowing that the man who loved her could never stay. And she was grieving for Lily, who would grow up with her father's eyes and no memory of his face. She stepped inside. The cabin was warm and clean and sparse. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a sewing machine by the window, and fabric stacked in neat piles on a shelf. Nora's work. The work that paid for the cabin and the food and the child's dress on the clothesline. Clara sat in one of the chairs and Nora sat in the other, and Lily went back to her slate, and the 2 women looked at each other across a table that was smaller than the distance between their lives. "He stopped coming in the spring," Nora said. "Before he died. He told me it was the last time. He said the line was killing him and that he had to choose, and he chose you. He chose the ranch and the life you built together. He wrote the letter to explain. He was going to mail it, but he couldn't bring himself to send it. So he sewed it into his coat because Henry kept everything important in that coat. And I think he thought that keeping the letter close was the same as keeping us close. He never mailed it. No. He died with it in his coat." "Yes." Clara looked at Lily. The girl was drawing something on her slate, a horse, crude and lopsided, the way a 7-year-old draws a horse when she has seen them every day, but never learned to put them on a surface. Henry had drawn horses the same way. He could build a barn and break a colt, but he could not draw one to save his life, and Clara had teased him about it, and now his daughter was drawing the same lopsided horses in a cabin 40 miles away. "Does she know?" Clara asked. "She knows her father worked on a ranch far away. She knows he came to see her when he could. She doesn't know he's dead. I haven't found the words." Clara reached into her coat and took out the letter. She unfolded it one more time and laid it on the table between them, the paper so thin and soft now that it barely held its shape. 2 women looking at the same man's handwriting. 2 women who had loved the same man and been loved by him and had not known about each other until death and a pair of scissors made the introduction. "I didn't come here to be angry," Clara said. "I thought I did. I rode 40 miles thinking I would say something that would make this make sense. But there's nothing to say that fixes it. He's gone. The money stopped, and you have a child with his face." "Yes." Clara looked at the cabin, at the sewing machine, at the stack of fabric, at the chickens in the yard and the frozen garden and the child's dress on the line. She looked at a life built on the margins of another life, a life funded by cattle money and held together by thread and silence. "I'm selling 12 head in Billings next month," Clara said. "Half the herd is mine, and half was Henry's, and the money from Henry's half doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to her." Nora's eyes filled. She didn't speak. She pressed her hand flat on the table next to the letter and held it there. And Clara could see the calluses on her fingers from the needle, and the fabric and the years of sewing other people's clothes to keep one small girl fed. "You don't have to do that," Nora said. "I know I don't have to. I want to. Henry carried this alone because he thought it was the right thing. It wasn't. The right thing is harder than carrying a secret. The right thing is this." She stayed the night. She slept on a blanket by the stove, while Nora and Lily slept in the bed. And in the morning, Lily showed Clara her slate drawings, and Clara showed Lily how to draw a horse that didn't look like a dog with long legs. And Nora watched from the doorway, with her arms folded and her face holding an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and wonder, and the slow, dawning realization that the worst thing she had feared, the day Henry's wife found out, had arrived, and it looked nothing like she imagined. Clara rode home on a Thursday morning with the letter still in her pocket and the coat still on the peg in her mind, and the knowledge that her marriage had been both real and incomplete, the way a house is real even when one room has been locked and the key hidden. She rode 40 miles through the brown grass and the melting snow and the wide open Montana sky, and somewhere around mile 20 she started crying. Not because she was angry, and not because she was sad, but because she was both, and because the world is built to hold contradictions, and she was only now learning how. She kept the letter. She folded it back into its creases and put it in the tin box on her dresser, where she kept her wedding ring, and the deed to the ranch and the lock of hair from the first calf born on their land. She kept it because throwing it away would be a lie, and keeping it was the truth. And Clara Wesson had learned in the space of 1 week that the truth is the only thing worth keeping, even when it costs you everything you thought you knew. The spring came, the river rose, the grass turned green in the Yellowstone Valley, and the calves were born, and the cottonwoods leafed out along the water, and once a month, a woman on a gray mare rode 40 miles east through the rangeland to a cabin at the edge of Elk Crossing, carrying money from cattle sales and fabric she had bought in town, and a growing knowledge that family is not always the shape you planned for it, and that love, even the broken kind, is still worth tending. It was not forgiveness. It was something harder. It was choosing to see the whole truth and not just the part that fit.